This is part 2 of my series on my Engage model railway project. Part 1 was just an intro to the project and to my background with the railways. This part covers setting up a baseboard, selecting and obtaining track, initial layout, design and track laying. First, obviously, I was going to need a baseboard. Rather than going with the traditional style of board, basically a wooden box frame with a plywood or hardboard top, I decided to go with foam supported by wood. A neighbour was throwing out a door, actually the whole door and door frame that they had ripped right out of a wall. They wanted rid of it and put it out by the curb, so I took that and I removed the frame, hinges, knobs, etc., reducing it to the bare wooden door. It was a small door, about 75 inches by 28 inches, so not big enough to serve as the whole baseboard as such, but I thought it would serve well as a base for foam board, offering enough weight and rigidity without being too unwieldy. The door I simply rested on a longish low coffee table which was already standing in the middle of the room where I was planning to put the layout. Then I wanted to build out 8 foot by 4 foot of foam board on top of that. 8 foot by 4 foot being the maximum I had decided that I could fit in and still be able to get around the room. So the foam board I used, for the foam board I used 1/2 inch pink insulating foam, which is lightweight and really quite rigid. I've used this quite a bit before when building RC aircraft, so I was fairly familiar with it. Since I was aiming at an 8 foot by 4 foot board, buying 8 foot by 4 foot sheets of foam would obviously have been best. However, I did not have any way to transport 8 foot by 4 foot sheets. They certainly wouldn't fit in my car, and though a friend offered to help me with his van was still not large enough to carry 8 foot by 4 foot sheets. And the whole thing was also further complicated by the fact that we couldn't actually go into the hardware store and look at anything due to the COVID lockdown regulations. I was, however, allowed to place an order for curbside pickup, so I ordered 4 sheets of 8 foot by 2 foot 1/2 inch pink insulating foam, and a couple of tubes of construction adhesive and a grease gun. I stuck the foam board down on top of the door in 2 layers. For the first layer I cut 2 8 foot by 2 foot sheets in half, making 4 sheets 4 foot by 2 foot, and I stuck these down with the construction adhesive crossways across the door. Then I stuck the remaining 2 8 foot by 2 foot sheets down lengthways on top of that first layer. This gave me an inch of foam board 8 foot by 4 foot supported by the door, with the foam board going in 2 different directions to provide extra support. In the picture you can see the whole thing waiting for the construction adhesive to dry. The instructions say to clamp for 24 hours, so here the top layer is weighted down with books and lead ingots, and round the edges the 2 layers of foam are taped together with masking tape, as it wasn't possible to press the edges there together with weights, really. My next decision was what to do for track. As I wanted to get on with the project immediately, if at all possible, I didn't want to order track and wait for it to come, and all the local hobby shops were basically shut, so I looked for private sellers on Kijiji, and indeed there were several people within manageable driving distance offering Engage track for sale. It seemed that the track being offered was mainly Bachmann Easy Track or Kato Unitrack, so I figured I would likely go with one of those 2 systems, both of which use an integrated track bed with a clip-together scheme. I looked into the comparison. Here's Kato Unitrack on the left and Bachmann Easy Track on the right. And here is the standard Bachmann controller that comes with their newer Engage sets. And here is the standard Kato controller that comes with their sets, together with some attached switches for controlling turnouts, or points as we always called them in the UK. It appeared to me that the Kato material seemed superior, the construction of the track seemed better, the Kato controllers, the Kato connectors of the track can easily be replaced if they break, and I feel the the track looks better. And the Kato controllers seem clearly nicer to work with. The only downside was that the Kato material was a bit more expensive, but I felt the advantages seemed to clearly make it worthwhile. So I looked at what Kato stuff was on offer locally, and I found one seller about an hour's drive away or a little more who was offering 3 unused Kato sets for sale at what I felt was a fair price. Thus, after a couple of hours driving, I ended up with the Kato sets shown here. an M2 loop with passing siding, including power controller and switches for the 2 points, a V5 interior loop set, so basically another oval but with slightly tighter radius curves, 11-inch radius, not too bad, and a V2 single-track viaduct set, essentially another loop but with sidewalls and pillars to climb up and cross a trestle. I did then deal with another seller a little closer to home, and from him I bought another M2 set, giving me 2 power controllers and 4 points with switches, and my final addition a bit later in the layout design process was a V7 bidirectional crossover set, which allows trains to cross over between 2 parallel tracks whilst travelling in either direction, and is again controlled remotely by a standard Kato point control switch, which comes with the set. I actually bought this one on eBay, but from a vendor in my own province in Canada, so it came fairly quickly. So let's quickly review what tracker and accessories I had available to me. Here are the contents of an M2 set, and bear in mind I now had 2 of these sets, so I had twice what is shown here. And here's the Kato standard diagram of the basic layout of the M2 set. Note that the set also comes with a power controller with mains adapter and remote switches for the 2 turnout points. Here are the contents of the V2 viaduct set. A bunch of pillars of varying heights and special track with sidewalls and attachments for the pillars to climb up to the viaduct on each side, plus a few standard straights. And here is the Kato diagram of the viaduct set. The 4 straights at the bottom are standard ones. Everything else comprises the viaduct itself with the special ramped gradient lead-up tracks and pillars. This makes it a bit of a problem for integrating into a layout, as 7 pieces are required on each side of the trestle itself, making the whole assembly a set of 15 pieces, which you somehow have to get integrated into your layout plan, if you want to use it as Kato intended. More on that issue shortly. Here are the contents of the V5 inner loop set, basically just another oval but with 11-inch radius curves rather than the 12 and 3/8-inch radius curves in the standard set. A power feeder track is included in this set, but no power controller, and they also include a level crossing track. The blue things come with pretty much every Kato set. The long thing is a re-railer, i.e. it is to help you to get rolling stock onto the tracks. And very useful too. I found it a devil to get N-gauge stock onto the tracks properly, especially stock with small bogies. The other little blue tool is for prying the connectors. I forgot what they call them now, but anyway, the little connector things on the end of each track piece. That blue tool is for prying them out should you need to replace them because you damaged one, or you may want to replace them to electrically isolate one track from another or to feed power in, which you can do through special connectors. Here's the Kato diagram for the V5 set, just a small oval with 11-inch radius curves. And finally, here's the V7 double crossover set. Actually, perhaps easier to see in this picture, all the contents. The crossover itself, you get the switch to control it, and 4 pieces of straight track, which together take up the same amount of space as the crossover. So you can put the crossover on one side of a loop and the straights on the opposite parallel side of the loop, and then you won't have to adjust anything else. The crossover is entirely electrically isolating, that is to say it has 4 tracks, 2 in one way and 2 in the other way, and there is no electrical connection between any of these tracks regardless of how the crossover is set. So each section needs to have its power fed separately, as no power will flow out across the crossover. This is unlike standard Kato turnouts points, where the power flows through in the direction that the point is currently set to make the train move through, but not in the other direction, which is not currently set for train movement. Hopefully this will all become a bit clearer as we see my layout built and actually controlled. Here are a couple more Kato diagrams which were helpful to me. Well, the top one is labelled Starter plus V1, and that's just exactly the same as the M2 set really, since the M2 contains the same track as a Starter set plus a V1 passing siding. The Starter set could be either what they call an M1 set with just the track controller and switches, or one of several sets Kato cells with that track and controller plus the rolling stock for a basic train set. The bottom diagram is really the more relevant one, showing how a basic loop can be combined with a V2 viaduct set to make a sort of ampersand thing, or I suppose you could call it a folded figure 8. This really provided me with the idea of how to integrate the viaduct set in a way that would fit on my board. Here's a little picture from Cato's own site of a temporary layout set up using a loop, a viaduct set, a passing siding, and I think that's a V3 rail yard switching track set. So, apart from these various purchases of Cato stuff, I did also answer a local Kijiji ad offering a small amount of Bachmann rolling stock cheap. I knew this stock wouldn't really fit into the prototype that I wanted my layout to follow, basically pre-nationalisation operations in the British Midlands, but I figured that, especially with all the COVID issues, stock that I was buying from the UK could take quite a while to come, and I just wanted something to allow me to test layout progress. So I responded to this ad offering some Bachmann wagons and a US steam loco. When I actually bought the stuff, I drove down to Port Cowan and bought the stuff. The gentleman said he had some other Engage stuff that was no use to him, so he would throw it all in. So I actually got the wagons, 2 locos, some old Bachmann track, not the easy track, the old-style Bachmann track, and 2 old-style Bachmann controllers. The locos were both US steam locos, and USRA, that's US Rail Authority, an early brief US experiment with railroad nationalisation. And a larger one, I think it's a big boy, I'm sorry, US stock is not really my thing. The gentleman said that the larger loco ran fine, but he didn't think that the smaller one ran. I had to do a bit of servicing work on both, but I actually had more success getting the smaller one to run well. Anyway, what you can see in this picture is my very first attempt at Engage running. The small Bachmann USRA loco pulling a couple of wagons and a caboose on a little oval of old Bachmann track, controlled by an old Bachmann controller, the big heavy type that plugged directly into the mains. The next thing I did was to set up the V2 viaduct set, mainly because I was rather unclear from the instructions how it was supposed to go together, and I needed to understand that better to go ahead with my planning. The only Cato things I've added here that weren't part of the V2 set are the power feeder track and the controller from one of the M2 sets, which I obviously needed in order to actually run a train and test. As you can see, the little Bachmann loop is also still there on the board. The loco on the Cato loop is a Minitrix Britannia, which I bought from the same gentleman who sold me the second M2 set. The Britannia is a British Railways loco from the 1950s, so a little outside my prototype, although you could say it's only just outside. Actually, it's likely now going to get converted. I've ordered the Langley white metal kit for a streamlined Coronation class, and that takes the Minitrix Britannia chassis. So, though it's a Britannia now, it in time may mutate into a streamlined Coronation class. Anyhow, having done that initial bit of setup and testing, I now got seriously into layout design. I looked at a couple of design software tools and even downloaded something, but I ended up actually not using any of them. I just ended up working in Corel, cutting and pasting track piece templates, all adjusted to a common scale. Why Corel, I'm sure you'll ask. Well, basically because I live in Canada and Corel was originally a Canadian product, and I've been using Corel for many, many years, and I'm used to it. So I never switched over to Photoshop or GIMP or one of the other alternatives. You could do exactly what I've done here in Photoshop or GIMP, of course, or any, reasonably powerful graphics tool. Anyway, I started with this Cato idea, which is, a basic Cato idea of combining a loop and viaduct. Then I added a branch in. So, you've got 2 turnouts branching off the inner loop, making a branch. Then I stretched it a bit. Then I added some sidings in. Then I added in an outer loop and changed the sidings a bit. All this just in software graphics at the moment. Then I just blew the diagram up a bit and cleaned it up. Then I put in a scaling grid, 6 inches to a square, so that's the size of my 8-foot by 4-foot board. Then I moved the sidings a bit, as there wasn't really room for trains under the viaduct approach where I had them. And I put a scaling grid on that. Now we're getting really close to the actual layout implementation. I've rotated the previous diagram 180 degrees to put the sidings on the right rather than the left. I've also adjusted the sidings again. I've added the crossover, that's the dark green thing with the black X at the top left, so that allows for transferring trains between the outer loop and the inner area, but doesn't transfer any power as previously discussed, so the outer loop and the inner area are still completely separate power control zones. I've also started to sketch in some scenic ideas, which are pretty true to what I ended up going with. A main station on what is now the far side, a rural station at the bottom left, a way station on the inner loop at the right, a shed yard area around the sidings, and a tunnel at the back left. And now I've started to think about roads, adding a level crossing beside the rural station with a road to the station. All this is still just graphics in software. I haven't actually laid any track yet other than the little tests that you saw. So now I'm checking the layout with a scale grid, and really this is essentially what I went with as my build diagram. The road is extended round to the way station, a couple of hills have been sketched in. Actually the right-hand hill never happened, as I ended up putting a turntable and loco sheds into that area a bit later. I did actually put a hill where the label Another Hill is. I've moved the crossover, the track crossover from the far side to the near side. That's again the green thing with the black X. I don't entirely remember why, although one obvious reason is that I wouldn't need an extension cord to control it there. The Kato things all come with 35-inch cords for some reason, and if your control switch is going to be further away than 35 inches, you can either buy a Kato extension cord, which just plugs in, or somehow rig up your own extension wires. The little red X's, which you can see, in the middle at the bottom and the top right, are power feeder points, 2 for each control zone, in an attempt to prevent trains getting too far from a power feed. I guess I should have made it clear here that I'm staying entirely with old school DC. There's no DCC digital control here. So I'm just feeding in 12 volt DC, and I want to feed it in both sides of the board, because otherwise the trains really slow down when they get to the far side of the board, a long way from the power feed. So now, with a plan of sorts done, I'm starting to lay the track. Before doing so, I've painted the board with a basic grey with some black and green shading, and stuck down some vinyl grass sheeting in some areas. I'm still a bit divided as to whether that was a good idea. I'm really new to this whole landscaping thing. You can see my printout of the diagram in the middle, and I've got track pieces laid out, and I'm starting to connect up the unit track as per the diagram. Here's my first Kato controller hooked up with 3 switches to control points. Wires are just lying everywhere at the moment. Here's another of the view of the layout being put down. I've just got the controllers on boxes under the edge of the board. This next picture is a bit of a diversion from the focus of the video. My first actual LMS, London, Midland and Scottish loco from the UK turned up in the mail, well actually delivered by DHL at this point in the creation of the layout. This was my very first piece of rolling stock that actually belonged to my prototype. It's an old Lima model of an 060 Fowler Tender loco, which I bought used on eBay UK. Anyway, back to track laying. Most of the track is down now, as per the diagram, a printout of which you can still see in the centre. Wires are trailing all over the place for initial function testing. Here's the view from the other side, showing the whole track layout with both controllers and all the switches now in place. The left-hand controller is for the outer loop with a switch for the crossover. The right-hand controller controls the inner area and has switches for the branch from the inner loop and for the 2 sidings. Here's a bird's eye view of the track layout. And finally here I've started to hide some of the wires. The points for the sidings are still controlled by the switches on the far side, but I've drilled holes through the board and passed the wires through and across to the switches, so now things look a little neater. There are still wires going around the edge of the board at bottom left, but I did eventually drill holes and pass those through the board as well. And here's the conclusion of this segment. The initial track layout is down, albeit with extremely minimal scenic setting, and here's a key explaining the different control zones, and how to control them and what isolates what, which I won't go through in detail. You can read what's on. You can pause and read what's on the picture if you want to get all the details of that. Still much more work to be done. In the next video in this series, I think I'll focus more on my first attempts at some scenic items. But here at least is my initial N-gauge track layout up and running.